today we're going to be looking at hashing. It's quite a short topic because a lot of other topics sort of like involve hashing. So I'm just going to talk about the basics of hashing, hash functions, and like a rough idea of the applications and what makes a good hash function. So we'll start with the definition of a hash function. So a hash function is just defined as any function which takes a variable length input and it returns a fixed length output. So it maps, for example, any number of zeros and ones, if you remember this regular expression notation. So zeros and ones times any quantity, and it maps it to n zeros and ones. So this is just like a binary hash function. We can implement it as in like most hash functions you'll see will convert an input to some large hex string, but the idea is that can just be encoded as binary. And hex is just another way of visualizing that. And another thing to note is a hash function is designed to be one way, and it's designed to be irreversible. So we can't undo a hash function if it's a good hash function. So I've got a few example hash functions here. H of x, so x here is the input to this hash function, and this is the output. And same here, x is the input, this is the output. So first of all, can we spot any issues with these hash functions? How could we improve these hash functions, or what's wrong with how they're sort of implemented right now? They're reversible. You can reverse the first one, good. So for example, if we know h of x equals 7, we can very trivially work out x as just being 6, because we can just do the inverse of this. Good. And 2, the output space is tiny. Yeah, good. So no matter what we hash x will always be either 0 or 1. So this can cause issues, which we'll look at. Whilst this one isn't as predictable, because this output space is tiny, that will cause issues. So another thing to note with this hash function is the output isn't fixed length. So obviously we want our outputs to be fixed length no matter what the size of the input is. This one would be valid because the length of the output would always just be 1 bit. However, this one, it could be anything according to like the size of the input. So what makes a hash function good? The first sort of point we consider when we make a good hash function is that it takes a lot of time to try and find collisions. So a collision is when two pre-images or two inputs to a hash function result in the same output. Now, the adversary, we assume we have some sort of like enemy here who's trying to break our hash function. They shouldn't be able to find a collision. And this obviously depends on the amount of computational power that they have access to. But a good hash function means no one, not even like the NSA, can find collisions, because we want hash functions to be as secure as possible and to protect like things like communication and things like critical just communication. Another point which makes a hash function good is it's hard to find a pre-image of a random digest. So this is me talking about that reversibility again. So if we have the result of a hash function, so the hash digest output, we shouldn't be able to find a valid pre-image, so a valid input to get that output in a realistic time frame, given the current technology. So I know there's a lot of stuff like quantum tech, which is looking more promising to like breaking hash functions, but a good hash function should be resilient and resistant against those kind of technologies, and we shouldn't be able to reverse it. Now, the reason why I say find a pre-image and not the pre-image is because a hash function maps multiple inputs to fixed length outputs. It means we're going to have some collisions. We're bound to have two things that map to the same thing. And I believe the next slide is relevant. Okay, no. We'll get back to that. Actually, no. Let me do it now. So we have something called a Pigeonhole Principle. So this basically explains why collisions exist, and it just tells us that if our domain, so our range of inputs, our set of inputs, if it's larger than our range, then there's always going to be collisions. So for example, if n items, so here n is 4, are put into m containers or 3 containers, where 4 is greater than 3, so n is greater than m, then at least one of these will contain more than one item. No matter how we sort of assign these, there's always going to be at least one collision. So this is why hash functions will always have a collision, because our inputs is a variable length input, and our outputs are fixed length. So there's a finite number of possible outputs, and there's a potentially infinite number of inputs. So we've got an example here. If we hash username password combinations to fixed length 256-bit hash digests, so this is what SHA-256 would be doing something similar to. We have this many possible values, and so as soon as we've seen 2 to the 256 plus 1 different users, then there must be at least one collision. Now this number here is a crazy number. I'm pretty sure it's a lot larger than the human population, so it is quite unlikely we'd reach this number. But the idea is, as soon as we do reach this number, then there must be at least one collision. 2 inputs must have got collided into the same output. Got a question. Is it possible for n to be equal to n? So, sorry, is it possible for n to be equal to m? Can anyone in chat tell me what would happen if, would it be possible for us to have a collision if n is equal to m? And would it be guaranteed for us to have a collision if n is equal to m? So if we have the same number of inputs and the same number of outputs. Okay, so if we had the same number of inputs as outputs, then let me just draw a 4th dot here for now. Okay, so we could have a one-to-one mapping, and that would mean there's no collisions. But it is possible that we'd have a collision like this, and some of the outputs aren't sort of reached by some sort of pre-image. So obviously, even though we have an output space, that doesn't necessarily mean our inputs will map to every single output. Because again, our hash function should be unpredictable. We shouldn't really know what a certain pre-image is going to result in. And we shouldn't be able to tell like how to differ this to change what our input is. So like the idea is, even if we have the same n and m, there could still be collisions. If our hash function isn't well designed, and if our inputs are like controllable by an adversary. Going back to this, okay, so yeah, so it takes a lot of time to find collisions, and it's hard to find a pre-image. So this is that reversibility, and this is people being able to find 2 inputs that map to the same output, because both of these sort of compromise the security of a good hash function. Okay, moving on. So types of attacks. So there's different ways where we might try and attack, like how we might try and attack a hash function and to compromise the security of a hash function. Now, a collision attack, I'd say, is probably the most basic, the most generic attack, where we can find 2 distinct messages. Here I've just called them m and m prime, where the hashes of those 2 messages are identical. So if we can find 2 strings, for example, if hello, or with our hash function before, h of x equals x mod 2, can anyone tell me 2 distinct messages which would result in the same result for this hash function? (15 and 19). Good. Okay, perfect. So 15 and 19. H of 15, that would be 15 mod 2, which is just 1. And H of 19, 19 mod 2 is 1. So here, we have a collision. So obviously we want to try and avoid these in our functions, but this is an example of a collision attack, because then we can use this depending on how our app is built. Our app should be built with the assumption that the hash function won't have collisions, but we should be able to still deal with them in a good way. I won't go into dealing with collisions here because that's more of a DSA topic, but we do have a video on hash tables, I believe, on the channel, which explains what we can do if we do come across collisions like this, and we're using it for things like data structures. But collisions in sort of production apps, we want to avoid them wherever possible, and so we want our output to be sufficiently large to prevent collisions wherever possible. This is why SHA-256 uses 256 bits, because the chance of a collision, I might be slightly wrong on my maths here, but it's something like this. It's a very, very small fraction that we're going to have a collision between 2 hashes. So that's a collision attack. Then we have a pre-image attack. So this is where, given a random digest y, can we find a message m such that h of m equals y? So here, when we had our h of x equals x plus 1, what would be an example of a pre-image attack on this hash function? So can we find a message m? So let's say our digest y equals 13. Can we find a message m which we can feed into our hash function to get this output? Yeah, good. So So if we pass in x equals 12, we've found a pre-image that results in this. Again, here I've put a message, because note, our hash function could be slightly more well implemented. So we could have something like, so if we had h of x equals x mod 2, so again, this is a poor hash function because of collisions, but this is also vulnerable to pre-image attacks, because if we want to find something that results in y equals 13, all we need to do is we just need to find any odd number, so 1, 3, 5, and so we can find a message that results in this. So we want to avoid this as well in a well-designed hash function. So yeah, that's another type of attack. And then we have a prefix collision attack. There wasn't too much information on the slides about this, but from what I gathered, it's a subset of collision attacks. So a prefix collision attack is just a specific type of collision attack where we can pick a prefix for a message, and if we append that prefix before or after the message, so if we know the hash of some message m, and we know the length of m, then we can append something to the message, and it will result in the same hash. So this is like a collision attack, but more niche. I've not exactly got an example prepared for this, but if anyone does think of one, feel free to drop it in the chat. But yeah, this is just a subset of collision attacks, and I think these two are the main two that we want to be aware of, and the main two that we want to avoid. Yeah, cool. So this is just something I found quite interesting. This is according to this source down here, iToolkit, the current state of cracking SHA-256. So this is what most like modern technology depends on, and a lot of modern encryption algorithms depend on SHA-256. Given today's hardware, crashing the SHA-256 hash of a simple password could take days, up to thousands of years. Strong passwords hashed with salt may take longer than the age of the universe to brute force. So brute force, the only way we currently can break a perfect hash function is brute force, which is just trying every possible combination until we find it. Now obviously a password theoretically has no limit to the size it can be. Some websites might implement a password limit, but in an ideal world, a password is infinite in maximum size. So we could be trying for an infinite amount of time to try and find a valid password. But realistically, if our with SHA-256, our output is 256 bits, so we can just try 2 to the 256 passwords, or we can try passwords until we've tried every possible SHA-256 hash. And so we need to try this many things to sort of crack the hash function. Now, we need to be careful what we mean by cracking SHA-256. It doesn't mean finding the password that someone used. It means finding a collision. So finding something which results in the same hash. So if my password is password, let's imagine this is a very secure password. I'll put some hashes, explanation, blah, blah, blah. Okay, let's imagine this is a secure password. And let's imagine we have a hash function here. Our server will take our password, it will hash it, and then it will compare it to what's stored in the database. So let's say in the database our hash is 01110. This is our hash in the database. It will compare it, and if it's equal to it, then it will let us in. If it's not equal to it, then it will deny access. Now, all we need to do as an attacker to try and crack this this security is find any other password which results in this same hash. We don't have to find the exact same password that the user used. We just have to find a collision, because the server will hash it before comparing it to whatever's stored in the database. Anyway, so that's why we want to try and have a secure hash function which doesn't have these collisions. There are other things we can do server side to improve the security of this. Things like salting, which sort of appends something to the end of it. So then we have to find. So then it might take longer to find a collision. So with salting, we append something to the end of it, and we hash it multiple times, so that just increases the computational requirement. We can also have things like rate limiters, so it's harder to brute force, and we can't brute force like every few milliseconds. We might have to wait a minute before logging in again, and we see that a lot on like most modern websites. If you try and log in too many times, it will send you an email, or it will lock you out for a few days maybe. So that's ways you can prevent against this. But the best way to prevent against this is to have a good cryptographically secure hash function. because that's what's actually protecting the password. Okay, so this was also something that was in the slides, message authentication codes. Now, messages, if they're modified in transmit, message authentication codes, they're also called MACs. Don't get these confused with MAC addresses. They're very different. But MACs, they can be used in symmetric encryption schemes to verify that the message was written by someone with access to the private key. So if we remember networking, I don't know how many people here did A-levels or maybe GCSEs, but a check bit sort of tells us if data's been corrupted. It gives us a heads up. So if we remember a check bit, it was something like this, and then we'd have a bit at the beginning and a bit at the end. Or for example, we'd have something like odd parity, where if we're transmitting 7 bits like this, and we're having odd parity, we want an odd number of 1, so we'd put a 1 here. And so that means if we receive our message and we have an odd number of 1s, that gives the receiver a bit more confidence that the message wasn't manipulated or the message wasn't corrupted during transit. Whereas if the receiver receives something like this and there's an even number of 1s and we're expecting an odd number of 1s, it sort of tells the receiver, hey, something's gone wrong in the communication of this message, so something must have messed up that message. A message authentication code is very similar. So it acts like a check bit, and recipients can reject messages that don't compute to a valid MAC tag. Now, there's 2 inputs, K and M. K is the symmetric key. So because we're using symmetric encryption, both the sender and the receiver are going to have access to this key. So this is the shared key. And M is the message that we're encrypting. Now, without the adversary knowing the key K, they can't generate a valid tag. So this means that only the sender and the recipient can generate these message authentication codes. And so when you send the message, the sender would send the message, and they'd also send a MAC, a message authentication code. And so this acts sort of like a signature, but signatures are a bit more complex than this and go a bit deeper than this. But it's sort of like a baby signature that you can attach to a plain text message. And so I might send you a message, and I'll send you a message authentication code, and you can then generate that same message authentication code using that message. So let's imagine this is Alice, this is Bob, and this is the message they want to send. Now, Alice will compute the message authentication code and add it to the end of this message. So this is the message authentication code. Now, Alice will send that to Bob. Bob will take this message, compute that message authentication code himself, and check if it's equal to the one that Alice sent. If these two are equal, then Bob can know for sure that Alice sent it, because only these two have access to K, and only Alice and Bob can therefore generate this message authentication code. Does that make sense? Are there any questions about that? It is sort of just like proving that you know something. And so anyone can read this message. This message is sent in plain text, but it's just proving that someone sent it. That this is just proving who sent it. Okay, so if we want to measure the performance of a hash function, this is sort of going back to finding collisions or breaking or cracking hash functions. We can sort of estimate the performance of a computer using teraflops. So a teraflop measures computational power. More specifically, a flop is a floating point operation per second. And so a teraflop is just that on, I think it's a billion. I'm not sure. Correct me if I'm wrong. But teraflops can be a rough proxy for systems' raw compute capability. I say proxy because it's not exactly accurate for all hash functions. It's not relevant to all hash functions. Some hash functions might not just rely on floating point operations. For example, SHA-256, which a lot of things use, requires a lot of bitwise operations, modular additions, logical functions, and so these things aren't necessarily always correlated to how well a computer can do floating point operations. But this gives us a rough estimate of how powerful a computer is and how fast it can brute force different things. And we've gone over the Pigeonhole Principle. That's everything I wanted to cover on hash functions. It was quite a short session, but I just wanted to get the basics sort of across. Are there any questions? Anything anyone's maybe unsure about that they'd like me to go over? I think Terra is 1 trillion. Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, so Killer is 1,000, Mega is 1,000,000, Giga is 1,000,000,000, Terra is 1 trillion. Yeah, that seems about right. Did we need to know a proof from the first lecture? What proof are you talking about? I don't think so. There might be. I'll look over it and get back to you, but I don't think there's any proofs we need to remember. I think as long as you understand the concepts and you can apply them, then we're good. But yeah, if there's no other questions, I'll just wait a few minutes. But do we need to know anything about MD? Again, I think MD is an example of a hash function. So for those who aren't aware, MD, I can't remember what it stands for. Message digest, I think. It's just a type of hash function, or like a group of hash functions. So you have things like MD5, MD6. A lot of those hash functions are quite flawed. People have found collisions and flaws in the actual algorithms. But I mean, it's good knowledge to sort of be aware that other hash functions exist. But I don't imagine they'd test us on specific hash functions. I think more importantly, it's about knowing the concepts, knowing why we want to prevent collisions, knowing what makes a hash function good. Yeah, I'm going to stop the recording here. Thanks for. Oh, actually, we've got a question. Why do you need a key to compute the message authentication code? Is it used to calculate it or just to encrypt it? So the key in a message authentication code, we're not trying to encrypt anything. We're not trying to prevent anyone from seeing the message. What we're trying to do is prove that we wrote the message. So if Alice wants to prove that she wrote something, and she wants to send that message, she will compute the MAC for that message. And no one else can do that. So if Charlie, let's put Charlie down here. If Charlie wants to send that same message, he won't be able to compute a message authentication code because he doesn't have the key. So even if he sends that to B, Bob will know that Charlie didn't send this, or Bob will know that Alice didn't send this because Charlie didn't add the message authentication code. By symmetric encryption schemes, all that means is if we have two people, they both share the same key. So let's say I'm going to draw a very bad key. Okay, this is our key, K. Both Alice and Bob have this key. Let me write their names out. I think an example makes this a bit clearer. So we have Alice and Bob. Now, if Alice wants to send hello, our message authentication code function, so our this function might just be something like appends the key. So let's say the key is A. We might append the key to this and then hash it. So we might take the hash of something like hello A, and this would be our message authentication code. So only Alice and Bob know what the key is. So only they can append this key to the end of the message and hash it. If Charlie wants to send a message, he doesn't know what he needs to append to the end of his message and hash to generate this message authentication code. So only Alice can generate this hash, and Bob can generate this hash as well. So when Alice sends hello to Bob, Bob can append A to it because Bob knows this key as well, and Bob can hash it. And if it's equal to this thing that Alice sent over, then that means that Alice sent it, because no one else has access to this key. Only Alice and Bob do. Does that make sense? So it's nothing to do with encryption. It's more so verification and making sure that you can prove who sent something. Basically, the message contains the hashed output, and Bob can authenticate it. Yeah, perfect. So Bob can authenticate this by generating that same hashed output, and if it's the same, then that means it must have been sent by someone else who could generate that hash. Cool. Yeah, I'm gonna end the session here. If there are any other questions, whenever, just drop them in the Security Networks channel. Or if you're on YouTube, just drop them in the comments. I'll try and check that out. But yeah, thanks for coming, guys. Let's rock Texie Land. Let's get it pumping again. Yeah, cheers for coming. See you soon.